Welcome back to The Gentlemanly Things. I'm Brian Lipstein, your host. It's a show not about how to be a gentleman, but the art of living like one. We have a phenomenal guest today, one of the third generation grape growers in Napa Valley, whose family settled there before it was even on the map. And he's going to share his story with us and his family story and where they see things going. But before that, I just wanted to share, I wore this specific coat for this conversation. The pockets are shaped in the shape of a wine glass, and I've been sharing with you name labels. The name label of this coat says "Crush It." It is a double entendre into the crush of harvest and making wine, but also crushing your day and crushing what's ahead of you by feeling amazing wearing your jacket. So just wanted to bring that to light, share that fun little story. We're going to dive in with Bruce Phillips, and I can't wait for you guys to hear this conversation that we have ahead of us. This is part one with Bruce Phillips behind the scenes in Napa Valley. Enjoy. Welcome back, everybody. I'm really excited today to bring you a super special guest, my friend Bruce Phillips, who lives in the Napa Valley and has been there for quite some time. We had the good fortune to be introduced to one another through a mutual wine friend of mine here in Philadelphia, who has also been a longtime supporter of Bruce and actually has some of their originally bottled wines all the way back to, I believe their first vintage was 2008. I have that right, Bruce?
That's correct.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. So 2008. And I know my friend that made this introduction, had the first Magnum they ever produced, with the number 1 on it. And we got to enjoy that a few years ago as well. But I want to introduce Bruce first and then just jump right into the conversation because I know that this is going to be really interesting for you guys, whether you're into wine or just other gentlemanly things. We're going to have a great conversation. Bruce is a gentleman at heart, and we definitely connected because of that. So he gave me a bio. I'm going to just read that real quick, and then we'll jump into it. And so Bruce is a 25-year veteran of the food and consumer product industry. He has participated in the success of a variety of consumer product ventures, from Odwalla to Constellation Brands Incorporated. Bruce is managing partner of Phillips Family Farming, LLC, a premium Oakville wine grape grower and producer of the VHR Vine Hill Ranch and Baker and Hamilton Cabernet Sauvignon estate bottled wines. As past president of the Napa Valley Grape Growers and past chair of the California Association of Wine Grape Growers and the Land Trust of Napa County, Bruce has served on the boards of the Queen of the Valley Hospital Foundation and the Blue Oak School, a progressive primary school in Napa, California. Bruce lives in Oakville with his wife, Heather, and their 2 children, Nate and Eliza, and he enjoys in his free time spending time outdoors with his family whenever possible, whether that be sailing, skiing, hiking, fishing, or hunting. So what an intro. Bruce, thank you for joining us today. Really excited, like I said, for where this conversation is going to go.
Thank you so much, Brian, for having me. I'm very excited to have this conversation.
Awesome. Yeah. And so, Bruce, we first met, I got to visit actually the room it looks like you're sitting in. There's a fireplace behind you, and we sat by that fire, I think to the point of getting you in trouble with your wife because we spent so much time together just chatting and enjoying the company back in April of 2024. And right around that time is when I really was kind of starting to conceptualize the idea of this show. And the conversation with you is one that really hit home as to, hey, I've got some stuff to share, and I know some people who have some stuff to share. So, that conversation was enjoyable to say the least. But also really was part of the foundation of the creation of this show. So I'm really honored that you are sharing your time with us today and sharing some of your expertise in Napa. But why don't you start? Anything else you want to add to that introduction, or maybe a little bit of background about your family, your estate, that you want to give everybody a little bit of picture of who you are and how you got to where you are?
Well, nothing in particular, but I remember that afternoon well, and it was it's funny. Today, we completed harvest here at Vine Hill Ranch a week ago, Monday, for the 25 season. But when you were here in April, it was a cold, rainy day, and we had a fire lit. And I remember our discussion well. So I've been looking forward to this. I can tell you a little bit about the vineyard and some background on who Vine Hill Ranch is. But my family came to the Napa Valley in the mid-50s, 1956, and acquired, it was a sizable purchase at the time. And my grandfather brought us here from the California coast. He was a cattleman about an hour west of here, and acquired this property. At the time, it looked very different. It was majority of this property had been rededicated post-Prohibition to walnut, which at the time was the second largest commodity crop in Napa County. But over time, my mother and father redeveloped this property to dedicate it entirely to Cabernet Sauvignon. Although in my lifetime, we've rooted every Bordeaux variety short of Malbec to this site. But it is uniquely a Cabernet Sauvignon vineyard site. We farm a little over 70 acres here within about a 600-acre holding. We rise from what are known as the benchlands on the slopes of the Mayacamas Range to the tops of the Mayacamas Range to our west. So the majority of this property is dedicated to wildland, and it's a remarkably beautiful place that is uniquely attuned to bring forward incredible Cabernet Sauvignon wine grape. We have been, as you mentioned, we're primarily wine grape growers. And have been. I believe we're about to cross our 70th season on this property. I'm third generation alongside my two sisters who farm this site. And the majority of the wine grape is sold to a body of vintner partners. This year, we have 13 vintner partners who have taken possession of a remarkable 2025 crop, 8 of which produce wines that are named for the vineyard. So bear the Vine Hill Ranch vineyard designation on those bottlings. And all of them are gaining tremendous accolade for their wines. So it's an incredible day in the sun for the vineyard, Vine Hill Ranch, but it's generational in its nature. It's I look at any glass of wine that I have the opportunity to enjoy. I mean, there are generations of effort that bring that to place, and from the farming and developing a vineyard appropriately to a site to farming it effectively every year and ultimately bringing it to glass in the cellar. So it's a remarkably rewarding venture, and we're very fortunate to be on this site.
I love that. Thanks for the background, right? So third generation, been there since the 50s. What did Napa look like in the 50s? I found your kind of history that you provided us in our first conversation interesting. So I want to kind of set the evolution of Napa just a little bit. It can be a short synopsis, but
Sure.
From the 50s to today, what did it look like then? How did it shift, and where do you think it is today? Maybe we'll talk later where it's going.
Sure. Well, when we arrived here in the mid 50s, this place was a very depressed, very diverse commodity agricultural economy. You need to look back decades prior to the 20s and 30s to understand why it looked that way. The Prohibition era was obviously devastating to what was a pretty vibrant wine grape growing and winemaking effort here in the Napa Valley at the time. In 1919, at the onset of Prohibition, there were roughly 10,000 acres in Napa County dedicated to wine grape and resultant winemaking. I believe there were roughly 100 producers or vintners bringing those wine grape to market in various bottlings. But Prohibition overnight became illegal. And while impactful certainly to producers of wine and to distillers of alcohol, you have to think that there really wasn't a meaningful harvest of 1920. There was no market for wine grape to produce wines in 1920, and Prohibition lasted for 14 years. So over time, growers had to cut over to other crops. And even by the time my family arrived here in 56, it hadn't recentered on a value-added crop like wine grape as we have today. And I think if you look back, I think 8 vintners survived the Prohibition era, largely by producing wines for the church for sacramental purposes. And even by the time we arrived here in the Valley, there were less than 10 buyers of wine grape or vintners at play in the market, and they had tremendous price control. We weren't producing wines of tremendous caliber at that time. The American public hadn't embraced wine at the table the way it has today. And so, my family's history on this site sort of witnessed what has brought us to this point. And so tripping through time, it's interesting. So as I said, when we arrived here, the majority of this property was dedicated to walnut. There was about what is today Vine Hill Ranch, roughly 30% had been dedicated to hay and alfalfa. And the balance was a body of older plantings dedicated largely to a variety called Valdiguet or Napa Gamay. And that was the mainstay of red table wine back in the moment. But, it's sort of interesting to think back on the hay planting, which I can't show you this vineyard, but I'm looking out the window over what we call our Block 6. It's roughly a 20-acre span that embraces the center section of the vineyard up onto the Mayakama slope. That had been hayed for a number of seasons, and there's no more of a commodity crop than hay or alfalfa. And this particular portion of the vineyard is arguably the finest viticultural site on this property. And to have it dedicated to a crop like hay or alfalfa speaks to a mindset. These were landowners who were trying to piece together cash flow to stay on the land, and they hadn't rededicated to a crop like wine grape, value-added crop. They were just trying to stay on the land. Today, a site like that no one would consider dedicating it to hay or alfalfa, short of maybe laying it fallow and regenerating the soils for tillage. So it's sort of a remarkable mindset given where we stand today in the Napa Valley. Continuing on, my mother and father focused on wine grape and brought forward a vineyard of caliber here. And there are a number of challenges from a farming standpoint that you face every year, but the market environment in my father's time on this vineyard transformed really through the 80s. And you have to credit certain seminal characters in the history of this valley that brought forward fine wine and viticultural practices that supported them through the 40s and into the 80s. So historically, when my grandfather purchased this property, we had a very coveted contractual relationship with an important producer at the time, remains important, but called Beaulieu Vineyards, or BV, up in Rutherford. They were one of 6 or 8 that actually navigated the Prohibition era. And at the time, they were owned by a family by the name of Dupin. They were French. And the post-Prohibition era is interesting to look at because you have to think Prohibition is repealed. And if you're a winemaker or a distiller, you're probably pretty excited to get back to what you had intended to do 14 years prior. And so in the moment, winemakers would, I would imagine, throw back tarps off their equipment if they'd idled through the Prohibition era, or even if they had produced wines for the church through that period. Well, these weren't wines necessarily of caliber, and they weren't compensated well for the resultant wines. And so their practice became fairly dated, and their facilities, whether idle or operating at that level, Well, they weren't, the practice became fairly dated, and their facilities became sort of dusty, and bacteria began to form. And that's a problem because winemaking requires cleanliness. You combine that with the fact that any talent that may have been at play prior to the onset of Prohibition, well, they had probably moved on or possibly passed in the time frame that Prohibition lasted. But probably the most impactful thing was that what vineyard remained, well, it wasn't farmed very well because those wine grape growers weren't compensated well for the fruit. And so there was a lot of very sick vineyard, a lot of virus across what remained. And you put all that together, and those early post-Prohibition wines were horribly flawed. And it cemented a reputation for American, California, Napa Valley wines as being grossly inferior to the old world, primarily Bordeaux in the case of Bordeaux varieties. And I can remember as a kid, my father, reiterating, how this appellation was summarily dismissed for its efforts. And so very difficult to bring forward premium bottlings, let alone bring forward plantings that could support wines of caliber, because there really wasn't a market for premium wine grape and resultant wines. Well, back to Beaulieu, again, we had all of the fruit from Vine Hill Ranch at the period. Now, in the moment, we were roughly 200 acres under vine through this period. And the Depins went to Bordeaux, and they recruited a gentleman by the name of André Tchelistcheff to come to the Napa Valley. And he came to Beaulieu and was tasked, I would imagine, with cleaning up their facility and training their staff in how to make wines in the old world style, and then working in their estate holdings, in their vineyards, which sit on a very similar aspect to Vine Hill Ranch on the slopes of the Mayacamas in what is now the Rutherford appellation, and lift their viticultural practices, and then begin to work with their contract growers, among them Vine Hill Ranch. So my father had the opportunity to work with André Tchelistcheff. Well, André has a legacy in this valley, a footprint of influencing viticultural practice and winemaking across this valley. So he's a seminal character in this iteration of this appellation. But he brings forward a bottling called the Georges Latour Private Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, today, that bottling is still in production. Today, Beaulieu Vineyards is owned by Diageo, big beverage alcohol conglomerate, but it remains important. But historically, if you look back to the 60s and the 70s, well, that bottling was the masthead for this valley. It began to carve out a reputation for character and quality for Beaulieu, and in turn, the Napa Valley, at a time when, again, this valley was pretty well dismissed for its efforts. Well, the Cabernet Sauvignon that was delivered from Vine Hill Ranch was routinely incorporated into that blend.
Hold on, let's pause for a second, because I do want to get into that, but we forgot the most important thing in the beginning, which is enjoying some wine. So you have a glass already. I want to make sure I have a glass too. And I have a case of your wines behind me, so people can see how nicely they're packaged. So your wines tend to come in wood case, three boxes. And I popped my first one open because they are so young that I haven't opened any since I got them. But I popped one open because I wanted to be able to enjoy a glass with you today. And the packaging inside was just as stunning. So I wanted people to see that real quick. So let's open the case. Let me get a bottle open so I can enjoy a glass with you. And then it'll feel a little bit more natural listening to these stories as well, which are so far all phenomenal. So give me a second. So inside we have beautiful stamped wood. And then here, an image of the vineyard, a description of the vintage on the back, and this nice parchment paper that comes with it. And that reminds me too, you have so many historical records in that we looked at. So the bottles are beautifully wrapped. They're here in the wood holding. So let me get a bottle open, and I'll let you keep talking while I get this open and get a glass poured for myself.
Okay. Well, thank you, Brian. So I was just sort of tripping through time, and I was going to sort of speak to how my business, which is primarily wine grape growing here at Vine Hill Ranch, really works. And it said earlier that it's generational in nature. And essentially, as a wine grape grower in the Napa Valley, you're attempting to bring forward vineyard and plant appropriately on a given site, and then align winemaking atop that site. And if you're successful, that winemaker produces a wine that gains accolade. And if they do, well, then other winemakers begin to take note, and they start to inquire as to how they might be able to purchase fruit from your vineyard. And over time, you build a market. And it takes generations to build a reputation for wine grape, let alone fine wine amongst a collector body. But that's how the grape growing business has operated for generations here. Andrei Chelichev and that Beaulieu bottling began to establish a reputation for the western slopes of the Mayacamas Range on the benchlands and hillside slope of the Mayacamas in what is today Rutherford and Oakville to its south, including Vine Hill Ranch. Jumping forward, you have to consider Bob Mondavi. Now, most everybody knows the name Robert Mondavi. It's sort of remarkable. You can bring up that name anywhere in the world, and people understand the Robert Mondavi winery and Robert Mondavi, who was certainly another seminal character in terms of establishing this appellation's prominence. But he had his first crush up the slope here in what is known as the Tokelon Vineyard in 1966. And by 1974, the Phillips family began to work with the Mondavi family. And that was a very important relationship through the 90s. And I don't think there's any dispute. If you look at the 80s and the 90s in the Napa Valley, the global gold standard for Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon was the Robert Mondavi Winery Reserve Cabernet Sauvignon. There are 4 vineyard sites that underpin that blend in that time frame. Now, of course, the Mondavi family owned the Tokelon vineyard at that time. Vine Hill Ranch, in that moment, they had roughly 40 to 50% footprint in this vineyard. A tiny little vineyard to our south called Embar, and what is today regarded as 2 vineyards, Detert for their Cabernet Franc and MacDonald for their Cabernet Sauvignon. Those are the foundations of those great reserve Cabernet blends in the 80s and the 90s. If you look today, short of what Constellation Brands retained within the Robert Mondavi winery of the Tokelon site, all of those sites have now been rededicated to other blends, whether producing estate wines of their own or selling to other vintner partners. So it's interesting to look back at that particular blend and its prominence in the time frame and the sites that support it. Regardless, those Robert Mondavi in the moment locked up under contract everything from the Robert Mondavi winery and the Tokelon site through to the Embar site immediately south of us under contract, short of one vineyard, which is Tom and Martha May's Martha's Vineyard, which was committed to Joe Heitz and Heitz Cellars. So moving on, I guess the big moment that happened here happened in the 80s. And in 1985, we were beset by a phylloxera epidemic that resulted in the removal and redevelopment of roughly 2/3 of the planted acreage in Napa County in a very short time frame, roughly 8 years, 85 to 93, because of this, what we call a root louse called phylloxera, affecting a very particular type of plant material that had grown very popular in the 70s, a rootstock called AXR1 that failed uniformly to phylloxera. Well, while hugely painful, it's very expensive business to redevelop vineyard. And my father and mother's generation, I mean, they built this valley in this moment, and they had a vision to plant appropriately to site and bring forward vineyard plantings and resultant wines that could compete with the old world, namely Bordeaux. And my father's story is sort of emblematic of what happened in this valley at that time. So I'll take a moment just to march through what he did. Now, the late 80s, there were remarkably high interest rates, first off. Now, on this vineyard, roughly 3/4 of this vineyard had been dedicated to AXR1 rootstock in the prior decade. And so due to its failure, it forced the redevelopment of the lion's share of this vineyard in a short amount of time. Now, interest rates at the time, if you went to a bank, were close to 20%. So that was fairly daunting.
Ouch.
It's hard to believe that people routinely were purchasing homes at 18 to 20% interest and navigating it personally, let alone from a business standpoint. But you combine that with the fact that an acre of land where I'm sitting today was worth almost a 20th of what it is today. So growers don't have a lot of cash lying around. I don't care what agricultural crop you're producing on your lands. All of your equity is tied up in that site, the value of the land, and the crop that you're bringing forward, which, as I said, we completed harvest last Monday. It's a remarkable time of year for growers and agriculturalists because you're able to take that body of risk off the table for the season. But my mother and father and a large body of growers and vendors decided they wanted to stay on. And my father ultimately, he did something remarkable. He took 2 years, 1986 to 1988, and he asked a trusted winemaker by the name of Tony Soter, who played a very important role in this valley in the 80s and the 90s, bringing forward remarkable wines for the likes of Arajo Estate and Spotswood and Schaefer and so many others that he influenced. He's many of his proteges, and including our winemaker, Francoise Pechon, were highly influenced by Tony's work. But he was in the vineyard sourcing fruit at the time, and my father asked him to lead a team of experts from the University of California and Cal State Fresno. Now, these are they remain viticultural thought centers, and they took 2 years to effectively just dig a lot of holes across what is today a 70-some-odd acre vineyard. And the effort was to try to understand the underlying architecture of this site in order to bring it forward appropriately on a single variety in Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, in the late 80s, we were primarily dedicated to Chardonnay variety. Chardonnay was the most important variety in the Napa Valley in the mid-80s. But as I said, this is uniquely, from a soil standpoint and a climatological standpoint, a Cabernet Sauvignon vineyard site. What they discovered was a tremendous variability in soil structures across this vineyard. I'll try to convey what makes Vine Hill Ranch unique in its is one of the things is its tremendous variability in underlying soil structures. Down low toward the valley floor are what are known as the benchlands. And these are alluvial soils that have washed down off the Mayacamas Range over years and years, and gravel and loam every season, gravity pulls them down and they come to the rest in what are known as the benchlands. Down there, you're going to dig a 10 to 15 foot deep pit. That's about as deep as you're going to get with an excavator. And you're going to find that the top 5 feet looks about the same as the bottom 5 feet. Those soils are just uniformly deep, gravel and loam intermixed. We've never hit bedrock down there. We don't know the depth of these soils deposits, but what they allow are for these vines to send their roots deep and wide and find their own source within soils that are able to hold moisture down deep, that they drain remarkably well. Now, as you ride up the hillside slopes, gravity's always working against you. So the higher you get, the shallower before you hit hardpan or bedrock. So on the high ground, vines are struggling in very different ways than they are down on the benchlands. A couple other things to hold up about this site. We're bounded by 2 watercourses. Hopper Creek to our south, which is essentially the demarcation point on this side of the valley from the Oakville Appellation moving south into the Yountville Appellation. Well, and to our north is an unnamed watercourse. We have to think about watercourses as they come off the steep Mayacamas slope. They lose momentum. And over time, they meander and they move. And they leave behind deposits of sort of mineral or a river rock where the creek bed used to be. The unnamed course to my back, behind where I'm sitting right here, it migrated abruptly north. And within what is known as our Block 7, which surrounds the farmhouse where I'm sitting now, it is known for the ability, when they dug this pit, you pass through a vein of this rock. And in Block 7, as well as in portions of our Block 2 on our southern bound. Well, if you think about minerality in wines, that's soil-borne. And the roots of these vines are in that mineral content from the old creek beds. And Block 7 in particular is known for this sort of mineral core that comes forward in these wines as they develop and bottle. So that's interesting. But probably the most singular aspect to this vineyard are a series of knolls that sort of move through the center section of this vineyard through our Block 6, our Block 5, and our Block 3. They are, if you dig down on the caps of these formations about 3 to 4 feet, you hit this huge sort of chalk white formation. Now, you can't move this formation, but you can break off a piece fairly easily with your hand if you expose it. And we're farming on the eroded content of this material. It's loaded with a mineral called rhyolite. These formations were formed eons ago when volcanic activity was leaving this region. These 3 positions were areas where magma was just sort of seeping up and then it fell quiet. So we're farming on the eroded content of these formations. And so if you think about, it's ashen material. So if you think about the ashes in your fireplace, for example, well, it drains really fast and it holds very little nutritional value. So vines are struggling in very distinct ways on those areas than they are on the deeper alluvial soils that have descended off the Mayacamas over years. So very special. Regardless, what they defined within this hole digging exercise from 86 to 88 were 12 distinct areas across this 70-acre vineyard that warranted being brought forward slightly differently on a single variety in Cabernet Sauvignon. My father's vision was fairly simple. He was a wine grape grower who wanted to differentiate his site, Vine Hill Ranch, from his neighbors by optimizing all these variant opportunities for Cabernet Sauvignon and then aligning winemaking atop this site and allowing them to source to more complex Cabernet Sauvignon blends.
I just want to comment on that. That's pretty forward thinking, at the time, right? Your dad did this study and saw the differences and brought in the experts. Did he have any expertise himself, or was he kind of reliant on just recognizing that there might be something different and, hey, well, let's explore this, see what we get out of it? And I love that you guys are differentiating yourselves from the neighbors in this way. Are you, the follow-up question to that too is, are you one of the first to do this in the Napa region, all around, or had other people also been doing this in other pockets throughout the region?
Yeah, an answer to that question is interesting to consider because of the scope of the phylloxera epidemic. As I said earlier, roughly 2/3 of the planted acreage was redeveloped in a very short time frame. My father was not the only one doing this. And if you think about today, today we are known worldwide for the caliber of our Cabernet Sauvignon wines. Well, the driving force for that was redevelopment decisions performed by growers and estate winemakers to plant appropriately to site, in this case, Cabernet Sauvignon. And those vineyards coming into character and quality with age, and the continued evolution of our farming practices and winemaking practices, for that matter, that have brought forward wines of world-class caliber. But it happened in such a short time frame at such scope that you look back on that phylloxera moment, and had it not happened, I don't know necessarily that we would have evolved this place as effectively as we have. I think it's an interesting point in history and an inflection point for this appellation.
What comes to mind, you made lemonade out of lemons, or you made wine out of grapes, because of a bad situation, right? And pivoting, figuring out the solution, but then also recognizing the opportunity. If it all has to be redone, let's do it in a smarter way and make it. Trying to think of like how I want to describe it. From a business perspective, right? There's a saying: niches make riches, right? I don't know if you've ever heard that. Sure. But the more focused you can be, the more narrow your category, the more you could charge for it, the more specialized you are. And essentially that's now what you guys are saying. Well, we're redoing it. So let's become specific. Let's utilize what we have to the best of its ability, and take advantage of this otherwise horrible thing happening, to be forward thinking 20, 30, 40 years, in producing the best from the plants down the road.
Exactly. It's interesting. It was visionary back in those days, you could likely have a dinner party of maybe 20 influential growers and vintners, and you could propagate a vision, and you could move this industry. And we're in a very different place at this point in this appellation. Today there are upwards of 1,100 vintners or winemaking entities at play in the Napa Valley alone, let alone across the state of California, with varying visions and brand prospects that they're moving forward. So it's much harder for this industry to coalesce around a shared vision today than it was then. But in their view, they wanted to put this appellation in a position to compete with Bordeaux. And it's interesting how we've evolved as wine grape growers and winemakers to, in my view, achieve that vision. And now we're moving sort of past that vision. I think what's happening today is much more Burgundian in focus. As an example, in Vine Hill Ranch, this year we have 13 vintner partners alongside the wine we're tasting today, VHR Vine Hill Ranch. As I said earlier, 8 of them are producing named wines for the vineyard, but each of those vintner or winemakers are focused on a small portion, maybe one sub-block or body of rows, and creating a bottling from that particular portion of this site. Very much akin to what happens in Burgundy in terms of Pinot Noir. and Chardonnay for that matter. But so we're sort of transcending what was the past generation's vision toward what I feel is much more. You asked me to talk about where I think we're going. I think that is where we have transcended to, and I think that represents the future of this valley.
Interesting. Yeah. So, and I think you guys are working with Kinsman Eades. Is that right? Are they one of the 11 that you're working with?
Yes. Within the Kinsman Eades portfolio, we're what's known as the connoisseur bottling.
Okay. And I've been fortunate enough that Rick, who introduced us, also turned me onto them early. Those are wines very hard to get. They'd sell out generally the day they release because they are such small production, taking, in some cases, literally just a couple rows of fruit to make a couple barrels of wine from. So, we'll be visiting, and they're going to join us for dinner on that Saturday. We'll be in town. Great. So it'll be nice to catch up with them as well. And it's just going to be a conglomerate of our trip this time is going to be a lot of what you're talking about today. We're going to be visiting MacDonald and Detert as well. So a lot of family driven history that we'll get to see how the intertwining building of Napa Valley really came together through those. And then also a little bit of the new style, right? Kinsman Eades only having 4 or 5 released vintages at this point are kind of in that newer driving force that you're talking about as well. Hey guys, if you've been enjoying this conversation so far, we've got part 2 coming at you next week. Like, subscribe, share with your friends. Please leave us some comments. If you want to get access to the wine that Bruce makes, talk to me. I'll see what I can do. No promises, but the way you get into fine wines that are limited production are through relationships. Leave us a comment if you're interested. Let's connect. I'd be happy to see what could be done. In the meantime, we will see you next week for part 2 of this episode. You can find the link to that in the show notes below. And we look forward to continuing this conversation that has been so fascinating with Bruce next week. So please find us there.